Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this Governance for Schools webinar. The focus of this morning's session is developing and monitoring the school's vision. We will start the webinar in just one moment, but just a couple of housekeeping points first before we do. If you're new to the platform and haven't found the go-to toolbar yet, there'll be a little orange rectangle with a white arrow in it somewhere in the top right-hand portion of your screen. If you click on that, that will actually allow you to open the toolbar, and it'll stay there on the right-hand side of your screen throughout the session. On there you will find the little documents icon, so you can download the handout, which is a copy of what the slides we're going to share today, and you'll also find the question panel. We've got quite a large number with us today, which is lovely, but if we could ask you to put your questions and comments into that questions box and send them, we will probably have to group them together just in terms of sheer numbers, but certainly will give us the opportunity to be able to respond to them. And last but by no means least, if I could ask you please, if you could actually locate the little hand icon there, and just by way of a sound test, if you can hear me okay, if I could ask you to raise your hand, please. That's great, I can see lots of people doing that already. Lovely, okay, that's fine, thank you very much indeed. So with no more ado, we will kick the session off. As I say, developing and monitoring the school's vision is the focus of today's session. I'm Steve Barker, that's me on the left-hand side of your screen, and I'm the head of the Governance Services team at Strictly Education 4S, and I'm joined by my colleague Linda Waghorn this morning. Morning, Linda.
Good morning, everyone.
And between us, we're here representing Better Governor, and we're delighted to be partnering with Governors for Schools to facilitate this webinar. And we will hopefully be able to guide you through it and answer all of your questions as we go through this morning. So with no further ado, I will move on to what our aims are for the session today. First and foremost, what we want to do is spend a little bit of time exploring the role and the responsibilities of governors in terms of establishing that vision for the school or the trust. What we want to do is to actually put that into a little bit of context so that everybody is very clear in their understanding of how the vision, once it's created, actually informs the strategic direction, and obviously coming out of that, the monitoring activities that the trust board or the governing board are actually engaged in. And as ever, what we try to do with these sessions is to explore good practice as we're going through, and today we'll actually think about good practice in developing vision statements, but also good practice in terms of ensuring how they should be guiding the work of the governing body, governing board on an ongoing basis. So as we say, please, any questions, any comments as we're going through, do let those come across to us. And excuse me, I'm recovering from a cough, so I'll try not to cough on air, but forgive me if I do.
Steve, there's a number, just a small number of people saying they can't hear anything. I think it might just be worth saying that if you can't, I'm putting a message in, obviously, but that there are a number of people that can't hear you, just to bring that to your attention.
Lovely, thanks, Linda. Okay, so as ever, we'll start off just with a reference to where this sits in terms of expectations and statute. You'll all be very familiar, I hope, with the core functions of governance, and of course the one that we're actually focusing on today is the top one, and that actually sits, of course, very neatly in terms of the wording, vision, ethos, strategic direction, with the main thrust of this session today. You will find this in the governance handbook, which applies equally to academies and maintained schools, of course, but for maintained schools you also find it referenced in regulations, and for academy trusts it's actually quoted in numerous documents that you'll be very familiar with as well. So this is going to be the focus of what we're going to talk about today. And firstly, I thought it'd be helpful to actually start off by thinking about, well, what does that first statement in that core function, clarity of vision and strategic direction, actually mean? And what we've done is actually reference this to a paragraph that you will find in the governance handbook, because this, for Linda and I, is actually how we hopefully drive everything that we do in our schools, from vision right down to the day-to-day operation. And this statement comes in the introduction to the governance handbook, and say this is equally applicable to academies as maintained schools. And it says the governance duty is, above all, to drive relentless ambition for the young people served by our school system, whatever the circumstances. So I think the key bit for me there is the two words in that second line, the relentless ambition. So a vision ought to be something that demonstrates an ambition that's relevant to the pupils in our school, irrespective of their age. So whether we're coming at it from an early years foundation stage perspective, or whether we're actually in an environment that includes post-16. There should be some form of direction for us here, which is actually about ambition for the future. And that's the start point really for any conversation about vision and how that informs strategic direction of obviously of the board, but actually of the school or the trust itself. And at that stage, we thought what we do is start with a poll quite early this morning, just to give us a little bit of a feel of where you're coming from, or maybe just to focus and clarify your thoughts in terms of where you're coming from as far as this is concerned. So we've got a poll today which is asking you to think about what best describes your motivation perhaps for attending this session. Obviously you all knew what the title of it was before you arrived, and that poll is actually up on screen in front of you now. You can select any that apply to you, and if there's nothing there that you think actually adequately describes why you are here, please use that question box and let us know that way. If you're not familiar with the platform, if you can't vote, if it's freezing for you, just try minimizing your screen. If you're in full screen mode, that should, for 99% of attendees, actually free up that voting panel for you and allow you to vote. And it's obviously working for quite a lot of you because we've already got 81% of you have voted. So we're going to leave it open for a few moments just to hopefully give everybody the opportunity to cast their vote. Okay, so hopefully all those people who are who were struggling to hear. I've got lots of messages coming up on the board now, so hopefully everybody's got their audio issues resolved. Okay, so there's a couple more people left to vote. I'm going to leave the voting open for a couple more moments there, and then we'll close it and share the out of the results with you. Lovely, that's just tipped it over, so we're there now. So I'm going to close that poll and share those results, and that should be up on the screen right now. There we go. Excuse me. So you can see from there, 37% of you, so just over a third, are saying that either your school or your trust is actually reviewing its vision this current year, be that academic or calendar, it doesn't matter, but that's obviously a very good motivation for coming along today, so thank you for that. 2/3 of you saying that you want to understand how the vision should impact on governance. 18% because you've not reviewed it for a fairly significant amount of time, and then we've got a small number, 5% of you, because your school's just joined a multi-academy trust. That's great, thank you for those. We've got a few other comments rather, I should say, have come up on the panel, so thank you for those. We've got Marianne is saying she wanted to know more, but really I just want to hear what other people are doing. That's great, Marianne. We actually always like the idea of sharing good and best practice with others, so that's a perfect motivation. Julie is saying that she wants to ensure in her organisation that the vision is sufficiently ambitious and robust. And we've got Linda here who's saying that their multi-academy trust has a strong vision, but the local advisory boards are considering their version of it. Lovely, that's perfect. And yeah, I think that's just about covers everything that we've got there. So thank you for that. So I'm going to hide those results there now, and we'll move on. Okay. Lovely. So our next slide really is about putting this into a little bit of context, forgive the pun here, but I think the important thing for us to understand is that the vision, whatever vision we develop for our trust, for our school, or for a local governing board within a trust, it has to be relevant to the context of that organisation. So context is everything in our view. And we are very keen that governors are not just involved in establishing that vision, but actually do take some ownership of that vision. And the only way we can do that is to ensure that it's relevant to everybody that we serve within our broadest possible definition of school community. So some of the things that we have to think about in terms of that context, certainly from a social and economic perspective, that has a significant impact. Of course it does. Those social, those economic factors, and a lot of those will have changed significantly in the last 12 months because of the pandemic. But how do they have an impact on your school, and how do they vary perhaps from your school to other schools in the area? The incidence of special educational needs and disabilities. Similarly, from another group perspective, the number of pupils or proportion of pupils that have English as not their first language. And obviously then there are other considerations such as faith, ethnicity, etc. All of those things that define what our school population is, but actually more importantly than that, perhaps give us a little bit of an understanding or a deeper understanding of what the needs of our pupils and their families are, so that the school can actually respond to those. We're then getting into some slightly perhaps broader concepts. Admissions, finance and resources. I've grouped those through to three together in a single bullet point because of course there's a little bit of a cause and effect impact here. Admissions in terms of the numbers of pupils on roll in our school, the numbers we're admitting each September, they drive finances, and of course ultimately that will have an impact on the availability of resources to deploy in the school, which actually then of course has an impact on your ability to perhaps realise that your vision, or the extent to which you can realise your vision. Parental engagement is a contextual factor, and of course we need to come back to the basics of why do we want parents engaged in our schools. Well, the reason we want parents and carers engagement is primarily engagement in their children's learning, of course, because children who have the benefit of parental engagement tend to make far better progress than those that sadly don't. And of course, that links then on into this concept of reputation. What kind of reputation does your school have within its local community, within the area? Some of that will be reflected in admissions, but not all of it. So reputation from pupils, from staff, but also from parents and carers, again, important contextual backdrop to what we're talking about here.
And Steve, if a school has been through a difficult or challenging time, and often, you know, that does happen to schools in certain areas and circumstances, that reputation is all about rebuilding that trust and that parental engagement and some of those other aspects, including securing the admissions numbers and the financial security of the school. So certainly for me, in my context, we are a school that has been through a challenging time in terms of Ofsted, and it is now all about rebuilding some of those things, re-establishing our vision and making sure that is clearly understood by our wider school community.
And of course, once we've got an understanding of that backdrop, the understanding of what that context is, we then need to think about what direction are we travelling as a school? Where do we actually want to be? And the heart of the consideration of vision really is about the answer to that question: where do we want to be? What do we want to be at some point in time in the future? And that point in time in the future, of course, will vary from school to school, will vary from trust to trust, dependent on a whole host of other factors, not least of all what your current ranking is in Ofsted terms, although you'll see we're going to come on and say something about that in just a few moments. So the reality is, probably for most schools, a vision is going to stretch a 5 or 10 year period. Doesn't have to, there's nothing mandated in that at all. And for some schools that perhaps are finding themselves in difficulty with Ofsted, so if you're in special measures, serious weakness, or even if the school's got a requires improvement judgment hanging over it at the moment, then the vision is probably a far more short-term one, which is about that trajectory, which involves some fairly rapid improvement or some accelerated progress in children's learning very often. But again, that tends to be short term, and in schools that find themselves in that situation, we would always expect there to be that longer term perspective, and the school would be moving on to that trajectory hopefully very quickly. Whatever else we do, we have to come back to that definition in the governance handbook, but this does need to be aspirational. So whatever our vision is, it should be taking us somewhere which is not an easy place to go. It should be full of aspiration for the dreams and the ambitions for all of the children and the young people in our school, as well as for the workforce that are employed there, of course. This is one of my particular bugbears, I have to say. I personally don't like visions which are predicated on some kind of Ofsted judgment. The idea of saying we want to be an outstanding school, I'm not sure how ambitious that really is. I would rather it said something perhaps a little more relatable from a parent and carer, and most importantly from a pupil perspective. It ought to be something about what we want for our pupils, what we want for our pupil population, our community in the broadest sense. Because ultimately what it ought to be is something that everybody can actually relate to and therefore use as their marker in the sand of where we're all heading. In other words, it is that, as that final bullet point said, it's somewhere, it's a direction that we're heading. Everybody has some clarity on that. We're all clear on where we're going, and it's something that there is a commitment to achieve by everybody. And of course that includes us as governors, because more important than anything else, governance has to have collective ownership of this. And I've just got on this slide just as an indication of what I think visions perhaps ought to be all about. We've got three different visions here, and there's no prize other than personal pride on this one, but if anybody would like to guess the answers to all three and just put them in a quick message. I realize we're going to have a massive tsunami of responses here because the number of people we've got on the call this morning, but just have a quick read and see if you can work out who those are, and you will actually get you'll get a name check if you're the first person to actually get the correct answers. Thank you, Mary, that is correct, but I want all three before I'm going to give you credit for it, I'm afraid. Thank you. Morag, well done. They are, in fact, you can stop sending the messages now, folks. Morag got there first. They are Amazon is the first one, Nike is the second, and yes, Apple is the third. Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that's useful fodder for any quiz you might be wanting to enter into over the weekend. But there are some common factors here which I think have got relevance to the discussion that we're having this morning. And what all of these visions have actually got in common is that they all have this idea that the organization, it doesn't matter whether it's a commercial organization or a school, but the vision is actually predicated on something that the organization wants either to do or to be at some point in the future. So all of these, the Amazon one, our vision is to be the Earth's most customer-centric company, etc. Nike, to bring inspiration, and again, the Apple one is to make great products that's not and that's not changing. So again, it's to do something. So there's something quite proactive here, and I just wanted to give you an indication, or a couple of examples perhaps is a better way of putting it on the next slide, of how you can see that replicated in just a couple of schools that I've picked out. But also you might want to actually think about, does your vision, the vision you have for your school at this point in time, does that do something similar? So I've just got two schools here. One is a school in Wandsworth in West London, and you can see on their vision statement has actually got these three segments to it. Their vision is that for every child to be ready to learn, inspired to achieve, prepared for life. But again, it's that to be. So there's something active about this. There's something that says, okay, our ambition is actually not a static thing. It's about doing something to take us to where we want to be. And again, no shame on my part, Collingwood College happens to be a standalone trust that I'm chair of, and our vision, as you can see, I won't read it out to you there, but again, is all about us being committed to the sort of students that we want to be developing as time goes forward. And again, just something as simple as that does have an impact on, personally, Can your students, can your pupils engage with that? Can the parents of your pupils engage with that? Can we as governors engage with that vision and actually draw from it something that actually we want to relate to ourselves, something that we see as informing that sense of direction that ultimately the vision is all about? And I can see we've got a couple of questions here just before we move on. Lisa is saying, when reviewing the vision, is it okay to end up with the same vision? When we've done this before, we seem to spend a lot of time discussing what feels like semantics. That's one of the potential pitfalls, Lisa. There is absolutely nothing wrong. If you reviewed it and you decide, actually, it's still perfectly fit for purpose today, as it was 3, 4, however many years ago you set it up, why change it? I'm not a fan of changing things for the sake of. And actually, you're right. I mean, but pulling the semantics can seem a little bit of a perhaps not particularly productive use of time. But actually, sometimes it can be very helpful. I mean, I'm a great believer in less is more. So I mean, I like shorter vision statements myself. And actually, in those, the semantics are probably slightly more important, I would suggest.
The other thing I would say there, Steve, is about how wide you spread your net of involvement. So you mentioned parental engagement earlier, you mentioned context. Context can change over a period of time in any school, and engaging with a wider group of individuals in terms of reviewing the vision could be helpful if that hasn't happened already. So engaging more widely with staff, with parents, with pupils themselves, and then using that management function to distill that consultation, that discussion, however it's been led and offered, into some meaningful feedback to that group of individuals, governing board, that then make some of those decisions based on that wider understanding. Because sometimes we assume we know, and feedback then can be quite enlightening.
Absolutely, Linda. Again, that leads, in a way, segue quite neatly into a comment that we've got here from Keith. Keith saying it's perhaps your opinion that having an aspirational vision for pupils and parents is best, but we're governed by how we review performance and measure that success from the Ofsted assessment. Do you not agree? Well, actually, I'm not sure I do fully agree with you, Keith. I think Ofsted is there as a little bit of a benchmark, a yardstick about what the expectations are. Good governance, effective governance, is ensuring that our schools are providing that level of ambition so that our pupils get the best possible learning, the best possible care on an ongoing basis. And actually, unless you deliver that to pupils, unless their parents are convinced of what you're delivering, you ain't going to get a very good Ofsted outcome anyway, in my view. So I think it's potentially it's the wrong way around for me. We don't do what we're doing ever because Ofsted are coming. We do what we're doing because it's the right thing to do for our pupils and our families, and that is being driven by ambition, which is hopefully related to vision. And actually, that's what we want Ofsted to recognise when they come, not the other way around. So it's a bit of a cause and effect. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying I don't think I see it in quite that order, Keith.
And sometimes it's true, and we've covered this in different webinars when we discuss different aspects of education. Not all children will measure their success by the same measures that Ofsted use. Yes, they are fundamentally important to the reason we have schools, but recognising and measuring success sometimes doesn't fit neatly into the measures that Ofsted use. You know, some of the things like the arts and children who are very successful in an apprenticeship after they leave secondary school, those things aren't necessarily measured in the same way, but a school can be very successful in creating pathways for those particular types of pupils related to their context. So absolutely understand you can't ignore Ofsted. Ofsted are only measuring the standards of the school in relation to national education policy, but actually the vision for our pupils, when we know who they are, what their life chances might be, the opportunities they might have, needs to be shaped around, our vision needs to be shaped around that context.
And we got a comment Sorry, they're coming in fast and furious. Apologies, I've lost it there. Yeah, comment here from Alexander, and Alexander's saying some of the statements, are they not closer to a mission for the school rather than a vision, which is also something that schools are to develop. I would suggest that they're not, Alexander. For me, the vision is about that ambition. It's about that direction of travel, which is very much what we, what is it? Yes, it is. It probably is what we're trying to do. I think a mission statement, if you have one, is more to do with how you do it. It's about those underlying values that linked into the ethos of the school, which underpin that. Linda's going to come on and say a little bit more about that later on. But I think we have to think very carefully about not overcomplicating the messaging here to our school community. To have a vision which actually spells out what we are trying to do, this is what we're ambitious for your children, for you as their parents, that's what all schools are expected to have in place. If you have a mission statement, if you have aims and values, etc., those are great, but they ultimately should help you in delivering the vision, would be our view on that.
There's a couple of points that a number of people have made around, if you get it right for your pupils, Ofsted will take care of itself. I very much support those comments. Thank you. And then there's another comment from Caroline, who's saying that parents often use the vision. That's usually that first part of the website that is visited, and parents use the vision to choose one school between another. So again, that might be something that fits in with some people's view of why it's important and how it can be relatable to parents making those choices.
And just, I think one other point, if I may, just before we move on, Martin's put a comment on here, which I totally agree with. Won't most schools have a similar vision because they all have the same purpose? They have similar purpose, and I think the point of the vision statement is not to come up with something that's unique and germane to you, but what it is about is something that you as in your school community can relate to. The fact it turns out to be something similar, and let's just take that Collingwood example that's on the screen at the moment. This relates to our pupils, we call them students because we're called a college rather than a school, but they're still our pupils. But this is about them. This is about developing them as the well-rounded individuals that we want them to be, to go on to the rest of their lives. Now, the way that we relate to that, the way that we say that's relevant to our school, it could apply anywhere. Of course it could, but it's saying that we serve a very diverse community, and therefore it's absolutely threaded through our DNA as a college, as a governing board, that actually we know about all of those different groups that are represented in our school, and we have to make sure that we've got processes of procedures, policies, whatever you want to call them, in place, but we've got things in place that actually make a difference to each and every young person, and that's what matters here. And it's something for us as governors to actually hold the school to account for, hold ourselves to account for, and to be able to then celebrate and demonstrate, so that coming back to us, that when Ofsted come to call, they recognise that. We've got this vision, those words in that pink box at the bottom, they're written big and large in the conference room. We always make sure Ofsted actually have that as their team room when they come to actually visit. And with a gesture of largesse, I always actually point that vision out to them, because that's what we're all about. Everything that we do, from our curriculum offer to our pastoral care, is predicated on that vision, and it is about something for everybody, and that something is the best. So I think we can relate to it, even if it is very similar to the school next door, the school down the road. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Linda.
Okay, I would just add to that, and there've been a couple of comments about the difference between mission and vision, and the idea that it relates to staff as well. The only last thought I would add to that conversation is that it should be evident across the whole school. It reminds me back to the sort of 50s, when there was a John F. Kennedy visit to NASA, I believe it was, and a man in the corridor sweeping with a broom, and Kennedy asked him what he was doing, and he said, "I'm helping to put a man on the moon." The vision of that organisation was demonstrated in every aspect of that organisation's life. I found myself in a school a few years ago making an evaluation visit, and as I waited, it was quite a Victorian secondary school on the outskirts of London, and while I waited in the reception area, on sort of very large and imposing walls that were the fabric of the building, were a collection of just simple white postcards. And when I looked closer, each of those postcards had a message on it from a member of staff, from the caretakers, some of which were, English wasn't their first language. They weren't necessarily all educated to the same standard, but no changes had been made to the statements they put on their postcards, which were all about how they were helping the school deliver its mission, from the cleaner in the classroom that said they were making the classrooms clean for the children, through to the senior management team. Nobody had been excluded from that exercise. So if you think back to the two examples that Steve put up on the screen in the previous slide, how is it that your college or school is developing responsible, aspirational, inspirational young people? How is everybody engaged? Are we reminding and supporting our parents to do that? Are we recruiting staff to do that? So it becomes part of the fabric of the organisation and is supported by the ethos and values. And I just on the screen behind you now, you've got an example of a set of values from a real school that went through a period of change, and as a result, the new head teacher was recruited to the school, and there have been a couple of questions about how do you get the head teacher on board with a change of vision. Often the point at which that happens is the recruitment of a new head teacher, and governors have a centre stage role to play in the recruitment of a new head or principal, and they set out as a governing board what it is they want their head teacher to come and lead. That's a point at which you are reviewing your vision, and when you're recruiting that head teacher, they are explaining to you during that interview process how they will help you to either refine and deliver the vision, or to deliver the vision with you. And sitting beneath the vision that the school has had, which is a living thing, and we should always be aware that it sits there directing what we do, are the organisation's ethos. And if you're a faith school or a foundation school or a multi-academy trust, often a multi-academy trust will have a very strong ethos running through its foundation. This is then supported by a set of values. And you can see just in this example that it includes also a statement as well as a sort of a value heading. And these become part of again, the fabric of the way in which that school is operating. So if we go back to Steve's example of vision about developing independent young people, responsibility then as a value, you can see how this may connect back. And the pupils in this is a primary school example, will quote these back to you when they're in a conversation talking to you about how they're working. They'll say, I make good choices because my actions matter. That's developing that independence of thinking and learning, and independence and linking back to some of these other values. So the vision for the school, the ethos for the school, and the values that it has as an organisation are fundamental to making this a living part of the way in which we operate. And indeed, it's a school. These values are for a school where I've recently taken over as chair, and we are looking at how we, as a board, can be responsible and can demonstrate that we are both living against the vision, but also we are undertaking our work in accordance with the values. So how do we shape this first exercise against what we do in terms of the way in which we operate as a school, as an academy, as a governing board? How do we change the vision that we've developed? And sometimes we take quite a bit of time, either when we're recruiting that head, as I said before, or when we're reviewing this, as a number of you have said, is an active operation within your school at the moment. How do we then, once we have that vision which outlines that journey that we're on, it indicates some aspirational destination that we want to be, how do we then shape that vision into strategy? So the strategy itself is the plan that describes the approach that we'll take towards delivering that vision across the school or academy. And it may be that your own school and board has some key fundamental indicators over a longer period of time, maybe up to 5 years, that sets out these are the broad directions of travel, and then the formal school development plan, school improvement plan, school business plan. There's no language that is prescribed for that, but your annual, more detailed plan might set out all of those activities in a fuller way and ascribe individuals to lead and describe in more detail how you will recognise that those have been achieved. So setting, if we think of SMART targets, setting out some kind of timescale and sometimes some kind of measurement that allows us as a board to monitor and evaluate whether in fact those things are, one, happening in that timescale that the plan had ascribed to it, but secondly, that we are monitoring the progress and evaluating the outcome. So yes, there are some things which very definitely can be measured by numbers. If we think of finance and pupil progress, there is a lot of data there that will allow us to make quite concrete have concrete discussions about where we are in terms of those things. And I accept that at the moment the pandemic has interrupted the usual methods of using pupil assessment, but we will get back to that point. But other things in our vision might be more difficult to measure in those very data-rich ways. So depending on what your vision includes. So how do we measure independence in pupils? So thinking about some of our strategy and how we will measure some of the aspirations in our vision are important in order for us as a board to understand what progress will look like. And it may include some information like a number of people being trained in a particular way, parental surveys being positive in some areas that you might be building into your strategy. But it is important that when you're developing your strategy over that longer period, that those key areas are clearly identifiable, because you're going to be using those to look at your annual plan. If you work with an annual plan that says these are how we're going to measure that detail in a more robust way. So if we think about strategy from the shaping the future, what is our role as a governing board in school development planning? We shouldn't find ourselves as a board at a meeting in the autumn term saying, here is a complete plan that the head teacher and his or her staff have put together, and it is presented to us as the finished article, and we then just take up monitoring activities against it. We need to, as board members, develop our own knowledge and understanding, and we need to set it against some key questions. We need to ask ourselves, how do we know where our school or academy is right now? And every school will undertake a form of school self-evaluation. It is often shaped around those Ofsted judgments, but it uses evidence. It is developed by the school and it is presented to governors, usually updated as different bits of the information become available. And I know, again, referencing the pandemic, we have not got outcomes data for pupils. So when we're looking at the quality of education aspect of our school self-evaluation, we're probably looking at the curriculum development, our remote learning offer while we were in lockdown, our assessment systems. Now we have children back in school, what we know to agree where the school is in terms of the quality of education for the summer term 2021. So it is important that we recognise from that annual process of school self-evaluation where the school is now, so that we can measure, even in some crude way, where we are now compared to where our vision is leading us. And then understanding both our vision in that detail and what school self-evaluation is telling us, which should be evidence-based. We need, as board members, to develop our understanding of what might that bit of strategy, that bit of the journey, need to look like in a year's time. So what things might we expect to see as priorities for the school development plan for next year? We should, from that school self-evaluation exercise, and that will be shared with the board, it might be a summary, we might need to develop and agree some discussion around that. What are the strengths of our school and what barriers lie in our path? So, for example, if we were already on a pathway where we were trying to improve, I'll take a primary example here because it is likely that the majority of you will be primary, but it will equally apply to secondary, but just in a different measure. What has been the impact of the pandemic on our existing school development plan? So it may be that we were developing an improved literacy strand towards all pupils leaving with a particular standard when they moved on to their next stage of education. We need to understand that the pandemic may or may not have created or increased some of the barriers. And so we would expect, when we come to have those discussions, and ideally all governors would have an idea of what is likely to be on the school development plan for 21-22 by the time we get to the summer term, because we will have received, discussed and understood the answers to these questions. And you will expect with that, how do we overcome them, to be some of the planning that is going on both immediately and into the following year. So nationally, for example, we know that the stamina for learning has been affected by the pandemic. How might that have impacted on the work that we were already planning to do towards our vision in 21-22? So you need to be participating by first developing your understanding and then testing your understanding and being clear that you know what you would expect as a board member to be seeing on the school improvement plan for 21-22, because it relates back to vision and where we actually are at the moment. And we will be informing our own knowledge currently because we've had an interruption to business as usual. Was there any questions that you wanted to field to me there, Steve? Or
no, I think we're okay at this point, Linda.
Okay. So how do we know our priorities are the right ones? Well, we need to be really clear that we understand what our context is as a school, the changes that have occurred, the changes that are occurring. I've been working with a school over the last year who has moved from a primary school that only has junior age children, a primary school that only has infants children, to an all through primary school. That's been a huge contextual change. It may be that there's been an increase in the movement of children in and out of your area. It may be that there have been a building, although we've had a big hit to the building industry, but it may be that there are more children coming to your school, it's expanding, but it may be more subtle changes
And so we need to be aware of how context changes over time, what impact funding has had on learning, how we are measuring children's outcomes or preparing them for transition to their next stage of education, learning, or the world of work. How are we measuring that? How will we know that we are doing a good job in that area? We need to make sure that we understand how policy, the rules that we have in our own organisation, drive our vision, and how our curriculum has been designed and planned, how staff have been trained to both deliver, understand, recognise and improve those pupils for whom the journey may be more difficult or needs to be more nuanced. And we need to understand how prior attainment, the point at which children were when they arrived in our organisation, will have an impact on any of those things. How we assign funding. We've got some additional funding. It is likely not to be enough for what we want to do, but it doesn't stop us believing that what we do is the right thing to do, and therefore finding ways in which to engage with and move forward with our vision becomes a shared activity in terms of strategy, but also a shared activity in terms of how we monitor and how we measure any changes to policy that we put in place. Are they driving those changes that we expected them to? How we have adapted the curriculum, and therefore how do we know that it is meeting the needs of all pupils in the way that we had expected. And so these we should know from both our understanding and the development of ourselves as board members to engage in those conversations about school improvement planning. We should also know then what we need to be looking at in terms of how we measure whether this is being successful, because if we've got the right plan in place, we are delivering the vision by our constant monitoring of the outcomes of the different phases of that plan and whether they've been successful. And that will also be a cycle of activity, because as we get closer to our vision, or we review it after that, let's say we set a 5-year key priorities vision, we would be then, as we move into the 3rd and 4th year, be starting to think about what does this need to be shaped, does this need to be reviewed and shaped in a different way? And there are some important things here that we need to recognise, that not everything that our school or academy does will be able to be measured by numbers and comments. Some of the soft information that we get will help us to understand whether we are moving in the right direction. So things like pupil surveys, parent engagement, parent surveys, finding ways to engage and consult in a wider way will also give you some information on some of those aspects that you might have planned to improve that aren't necessarily the same things that are traditional for us. If we can measure it, we will. If we can't measure it, then it isn't important, and that's very much not the case.
Linda, it's probably worth there's a few comments on the board at the moment. Probably characterised by Helen's question, saying, could we say something about the wisdom or otherwise of, say, a 5-term plan as far as SDP is concerned, but also thinking about the duration of the vision. And I think firstly to say is that however long a period you believe your vision actually covers, this slide that we've got up at the moment is really to say that the picture, however that picture actually looks for your school, is built up of lots of different factors. They are constantly changing. We know education is a dynamic process. So things will change all the time. The benefit of having a 5-year vision, or even longer for some of us, is that some of these bits and pieces may change. So the prior attainment, for example, piece, the bit that's actually talking about your outcomes, that may change, but actually having a longer term vision means that there shouldn't hopefully be a knee-jerk reaction. You might slightly deviate off your course, but you still know where you're heading. Helen's point about the school development plan and the wisdom there in terms of is it 3 terms, is it 5 terms, etc. I think again will depend on circumstances. There is nothing wrong. Some of us would say it's actually very good practice to have items in your school development plan, objectives in that plan that do cover 4, 5, sometimes even 6 terms. That's fine, but I think it comes back to the point that Linda made a few minutes back that says, you know, where do we think we want to be in 12 months' time? So understanding the milestones, and again, we've had quite a lot of questions on the panel this morning to say, well, how do we measure this? How do we know? A great question for governors to ask is, if you've got an objective on your school development or school improvement plan that is going to take, you know, a couple of years to actually bring about, well, okay, what's that going to look like in a term's time? So what's that going to look like by the end of the spring term? What will it look like by July next year, etc.? Because what we're doing then by receiving the answers to those questions is understanding the mileposts that enable us as governors, firstly to monitor progress, but then to evaluate whether that progress is actually sufficient to mean that we will realise it. Because a school development plan that isn't monitored, that isn't evaluated on an ongoing basis, probably isn't terribly helpful, and it's actually not in the, I would say it's not in the interest of effective governance to have that. Sorry, Linda, back to you.
No, that's fine. I think if a vision isn't living in your school, then it's probably time for a review. Because if nobody knows what it is, you know, if it isn't part of what you're doing on a, if it's not forming that backdrop, if you like, for how you are making decisions, how you are developing the curriculum for the pupils, I think that's a really difficult job for any school leader to be able to do. Is to be working in a vacuum, if you like, of a vision that doesn't exist as a living, breathing part of what you are in a school. I think where for some schools that have had, you know, those very difficult Ofsted outcomes that they're trying to turn around very quickly, that vision might be a shorter one. And absolutely right that would need to be reviewed at a point at which that impetus for improvement in standards is no longer the driving focus for that school, and then being able to build out your vision that encompasses some of these other wonderful things that people have put on the board. And, you know, I would argue that improving independence and confidence in students or pupils would also have a dramatic effect on their standards. So it doesn't have to be one or the other, but it probably is a point at which you review your vision if you've been in some challenge. But the reverse is also true. Schools that have been given that badge of outstanding by Ofsted and have sat on that for a number of years, is it really, with the changes that have occurred in the meantime, not only to Ofsted but to context and this continuing shape change here, is it really fair to say that having a vision that contains something around being an outstanding school is suitably challenging for an organisation that has had that destination already bestowed upon it? So I think it has to be something that people can recognise. I agree with Steve that a short vision, like the West Park one that he shared earlier, is really clear to as a board. I'm thinking particularly here as a board member, it's really clear that you can keep measuring your activities, your decisions, your work, the school development plan back to that. And in a school with a strong vision, you will find your senior leaders doing that too. So we want to be, if we move on to the last bit of what we've got to share with you this morning, we want to be, as a board, part of an organisation where there are no surprises. We don't want to find ourselves as board members not knowing about some of these fundamental things because we have not shaped our own governance activities around being well informed and robust ourselves. So there needs to be robust self-evaluation going on, and we need to have some information
that comes to us. Now, it might be that there is a way of doing that in your school that is, and there isn't a prescription about this, but you should be receiving some information that shows you how the school is measuring itself and making judgments based on evidence. We need to see that those areas that the school has reflected on that need improvement are then are reflected in those key performance indicators or the priorities of the school development plan, and we should be engaging with those conversations and approving that that plan is the right plan for our school, because we as board members recognise how it has been set out against that self-evaluation. We need to understand and live our ethos and values-led school life and see that they are reflected and represented in the policies that we have across the school and in the procedures that the school has in place for day-to-day action of those policies into procedure. We need to make sure we receive enough evidence back to us as board members that we can see the progress of the school development plan that we have in place for this year, and that we can reference that back to that vision that sits behind that. And that will be both that data, that hard reporting, and the softer information sharing. Head teachers' report should be a very important document for information and sharing, so that we can really see what is happening. We need to have evidence-based discussions as boards. We need to demonstrate that we are holding the school to account for the vision. That's our first key function, going back to Steve's slide right at the beginning. And then having that vision in place, we need to demonstrate in our minutes that we are holding the school to account for the delivery of the school development plan, and that we are ensuring that our robust discussions, which demonstrate that we are doing an effective job as a governing board, are properly minuted, so they do show where we have held the school to account, how we have deepened and improved our own knowledge, and how we've reflected the vision in the work that we do as a board. So where are we heading? Well, I think a lot of this we've covered already. Our school development plan has a set of objectives for this September. The actions that we undertake to oversee are often very operational, so we need to understand what actions a school is going to take, what interventions are being put in place, how much money is being spent, and on what key priorities. So we need to see that these are related back to those objectives and plans that were set. And then by next July, in those activities that we have across all of our board meetings and monitoring visits, we need to be able to evaluate against those outcomes. How do we know we have achieved what we had set out to do? And so getting the plan right in showing that there are timescales and measurements to be made, then we need in our governance and the senior leadership team monitoring to be able to do those at those times that are indicated against those milestones that Steve mentioned before. The sort of things that we will be using to do that monitoring as board, well, we'll certainly be looking at our the achievement of those aims and objectives that are in those the school development plan, and relate back probably to the objectives that are being set for staff and our senior leaders. We need to be able to monitor that progress towards the vision. We need to have some discussions around how we are meeting the needs of all pupils, and those needs may have changed over the last few months. We need to make excuse me, we need to make sure that the school is able to demonstrate that we are the impact is being made on the progress of the plan, but in particular the pupils. Are they returning to those levels that we had pre-pandemic? Is that enough against our mission? What impact are certain interventions and spends having on that progress? Are we using the resources, our staff resources, our biggest resource? Do we understand how we are deploying that resource? Do we understand how we're using the additional resources and the finances that we're receiving against those objectives? And in all of our work, are we compliant with the law? There's a lot of different pieces of law that we are responsible for as a school or academy. So our compliance schedule, monitoring the effectiveness of compliance with all of those legal expectations, and then how the school or academy is adhering to that policy framework, making sure that we have the right policies in place to meet our statutory compliance, but also that any changes that they are effective at that school level in delivering what we set them out to do. So I suppose in summary, what we're saying here is, do I know as a board member where my school vision is taking us, driving us to? Do I understand the school context and how it might have changed, both in recent times and over a period of time? What are the school's priorities right now? And we may have had a little bit of a reshaping of our school development plan in last September, but we were still in the throes of a pandemic. And where am I expecting my school to be by July 2021? And importantly then, what is my role as a board member in shaping what 2022 will look like?
Okay, I think we've had a wonderful amount of questions, so thank you very much for those. There's one last question that I would just like to air on the panel that before we finish, if I may, folks. And Mervin's put a question up saying, once a new head teacher has actually been appointed and taken up their post, they are responsible for delivering the vision. Should that not be a catalyst for a review of the school's vision statements once they've been in post? I have a slightly different view on that, Mervyn, I have to say. We'll see what Linda thinks on this one in a moment, but I think it's imperative the governing body establishes absolute clarity on its vision before they recruit the next head teacher, because otherwise we are potentially putting ourselves in a situation where we might be in for a very big surprise. And as Linda said, she and I are great believers in that culture of no surprises right the way throughout the school, including governance. So I don't know what your response to that would be, Linda.
I think by and large, I would absolutely agree with you. However, and probably you've been in similar situations, Steve, there are times when a new head comes into a school and what they find from their more robust school self-evaluation, digging deeper, is not actually what the governing body believed to be the case, because maybe there wasn't a robust enough monitoring schedule in the past. And it is that's the only occasion where I can think of that together board and head might say, you know, this, where we thought we were, is a lot more challenging. The reality of where we are is a lot more challenging, and therefore we might need to tweak some of that. However, it's probably more about the school development plan than the vision in that case. The vision should still be the vision, but the school development plan is likely to be a little stronger and a little bit more more robust in order to get you to where you thought you ought to be.
Indeed. Okay, well, thank you very much for those questions, folks, and thanks for the questions that have come up throughout the session this morning. Linda and I very much enjoyed the opportunity to engage in some dialogue with you. Thank you for staying with us, and we look forward to seeing you again in the not too distant future. Thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of today. Have nice Easter holidays and stay safe. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you, goodbye.